The small town of Millhaven, Pennsylvania, wasn't the kind of place where strangers went unnoticed. It sat nestled between ridges of fading steel plants and coal-black hills, where smoke still curled from factories that had refused to die. The people here worked hard, talked straight, and distrusted anything they didn't understand. When Jessica Hall stepped off the morning bus that October, she drew glances right away. She carried only a duffel bag olive green, worn by years of travel, and walked with a posture that seemed too precise, too deliberate for someone her age. Her eyes, a cool shade of steel blue, scanned the street out of habit, not curiosity. Old instincts, the kind that didn't fade even after the uniform came off. To the people of Millhaven, she was just another new hire, heading to the Dawson Steelworks factory, a massive, aging facility that clanged and groaned like a living beast. The pay wasn't great, but it was steady. The kind of place where you could disappear into work, day after day, and no one asked questions. That was exactly what Jessica wanted. After 15 years in the U.S. Navy, most of them classified under SEAL operations, she'd seen enough action for 3 lifetimes. The Navy called it retirement. To her, it felt more like exile. The war was over for everyone except her. She'd left behind a team, a family, and a piece of herself on foreign soil. In her dreams, she could still smell the dust of Syrian streets, hear the radio chatter cutting off mid-sentence, see faces vanish in the glare of explosions. She woke most nights with her heart racing, sweat soaking her sheets, her mind still back there, in a mission that went wrong, and in the silence that followed. Here in Millhaven, there were no missions. No orders, no gunfire. Only the steady rhythm of machines, the hiss of steam, and the metallic heartbeat of a dying American industry. Jessica arrived at the factory gates at sunrise. Workers were already clocking in, men in faded coveralls, women with tired faces and strong hands. She nodded to the guard, handed over her papers, and introduced herself simply. Jessica Holly, new hire. The guard squinted at her ID badge and gave a short nod. You're with Section B, talk to Tully. He'll show you around. Tully. The name would mean little to her then. But later, it would mean everything. Inside, the factory was a maze of noise and heat. Sparks flew from welding arcs. The smell of oil hung thick in the air, and conveyor belts rumbled like thunder. Jessica slipped into the rhythm, quickly absorbing, memorizing. The other workers noticed her precision right away. The way she handled tools. The way she moved efficient, deliberate, controlled. At first, they assumed she was military. Then they laughed it off. Nah, one of them said. Too small. Too quiet. They didn't know that she'd once been the first female SEAL to complete direct combat missions in classified operations, a record the Navy still never spoke of openly. They didn't know that the same small, quiet woman had led teams through ambushes, breached enemy compounds, and survived things most couldn't imagine. She didn't tell them either. She didn't tell anyone. By noon, she was assigned to a team under Rick Tully, the foreman. He was in his early 50s, barrel-chested, with a permanent smirk that said he'd been in charge for far too long. He gave her a once-over when she introduced herself. Jess, huh? All right. Don't slow us down, he said, tossing her a pair of gloves. I won't, she replied simply. He laughed, a short, mocking sound. We'll see about that. The men around him chuckled. To them, she was just another hire who'd quit in a week. The factory chewed up newcomers like bad metal and spat them out broken. But Jessica wasn't built to quit. Hours passed. The machines screamed. Sweat poured. Most workers took smoke breaks just to breathe. Jess never stopped. Her movements were methodical, steady. When others grew careless, she stayed focused. When bolts jammed or valves leaked, she noticed before anyone else. By the end of her first shift, even Tully had stopped joking. But in Millhaven, respect wasn't given, it was taken. And her silence, her self-control, made the others uneasy. People who had nothing left to prove didn't understand those who'd already proven too much. That night, Jessica returned to the small apartment she rented above a laundromat. She unpacked her duffel one set of civilian clothes, a Navy-issued knife she couldn't part with, and an old photo of her SEAL team. 6 faces smiling in the desert sun. 3 were gone now. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the picture until her eyes blurred. Her phone buzzed a voicemail from her old commanding officer. "Holly, heard you settled in. Civilian life's strange, isn't it? You'll find your rhythm. Just don't disappear completely. You've still got a lot left in you." She didn't reply. She couldn't. She looked out the window instead. Across the street, a neon sign flickered bar and grill. Open late. Laughter spilled into the cold night air. Civilians. Ordinary lives. She envied them and pitied them at the same time. They'd never understand what it meant to live with ghosts. Morning came with the sound of rain tapping against metal roofs. Jessica arrived early, as always. She liked the quiet before the noise. It reminded her of pre-dawn briefings, moments of calm before chaos. Rick noticed her punctuality and didn't like it. "You trying to impress somebody?" he asked, crossing his arms. "No," she said, adjusting her gloves. "Just doing my job." "Well, around here, we don't work like robots," he said. "Ease up." "I don't ease up," she replied, looking him dead in the eye. The room fell silent for a moment. Rick forced a laugh, but something in her tone unsettled him. That was the first day he started calling her soldier. It was meant as a joke, but it carried an edge, a hint of resentment. Days turned into weeks. Jess became known for her precision and her quiet defiance. The workers whispered about her, sometimes in admiration, more often in mockery. She ignored it all. But small things began to happen. Her wrench went missing one morning. Her name disappeared from the tool roster. Once, someone replaced her coffee with machine oil as a prank. She didn't react. Not once. She simply cleaned up the mess, replaced what was lost, and kept working. Her calm unnerved them more than anger would have. People feared what they couldn't provoke. At lunch breaks, she sat alone on a bench by the loading dock, eating quietly while others smoked and joked. She listened not to their words, but to the rhythm of life around her. Forklifts, gears, footsteps. Every sound mapped in her head. The discipline never left her. Late one evening, as the factory emptied, she stayed behind to help fix a jammed press machine. Rick watched from his office window, annoyed and curious. After she finished, he walked down. "You don't have to stay late, you know. You're not earning extra pay." She wiped grease from her hands. "Not about pay. About safety." He raised a brow. "Safety? Around here, we take shortcuts. Gets the job done faster." Jess looked up, expression unreadable. "Shortcuts get people killed." Rick chuckled. "You talk like you've seen war." Her eyes met his, cold and sharp. "You could say that." Rick frowned, uncertain how to respond. For the first time, he didn't have a comeback. As she walked home under the flickering streetlights, her boots splashing through puddles, Jess felt something she hadn't felt in years. Purpose, faint but growing. The factory was broken, yes, but it was real. The people, the noise, the work, it grounded her. Yet deep down she sensed it. Conflict was coming. The same instincts that had saved her life countless times whispered again. She could feel tension building, like the static before a storm. And in Millhaven, storms didn't pass quietly. Jessica Hawley didn't know it yet, but the peace she came seeking was about to shatter. And when it did, everyone would finally see who she really was. The next few weeks at Dawson's Steelworks passed like a grinding engine, steady, relentless, and loud enough to drown out thoughts. The factory had its rhythm, the clang of iron, the hiss of steam, and the thick smell of sweat and metal dust that never really left her clothes. Most people got used to it. Jessica Hawley didn't. She endured it. Her body moved with automatic precision. Lift, secure, align, check, move on. Her mind, however, drifted elsewhere, to desert heat, gunfire, radio static, and comrades' voices echoing in her memory. But no matter how far her mind wandered, her instincts never faded. She still scanned every corner, still counted exits, still knew how long it would take to reach the door if something went wrong. To her, vigilance wasn't paranoia. It was survival. But to her coworkers, it was strange, unsettling even. The gossip began quietly. "She's off, that one," whispered a worker named Carl one morning as Jess adjusted a pressure valve. Rick Tully, the foreman, smirked. "Off? She's wound tighter than a drum. Probably ex-military. You can smell it on her." Carl chuckled. "Ex-military? She's, what, 5'6"? 130 pounds, maybe? You think she saw combat?" "Doesn't matter," Rick said, leaning against a steel beam. "People like her, they don't belong here. They think they're better than us." He spat on the floor and turned away, watching Jess through the haze of smoke. She was focused, tuning the machine with careful precision, as if every bolt and joint mattered. And that was the problem. She cared too much. The factory didn't reward care. It rewarded compliance. People who followed orders, kept quiet, and didn't make others look bad. Jess did none of that. During lunch breaks, she sat alone, reading or eating silently, while others swapped jokes and gossip. A few tried to talk to her, but her clipped answers and watchful eyes made conversation hard. It wasn't arrogance. It was conditioning. For years, she'd been trained to listen more than speak, to measure every word. The factory didn't understand that. One afternoon, as she ate on a bench by the loading dock, Rick walked over with a swagger that came from years of unchecked authority. "Enjoying the quiet, soldier?" he asked, sneering. Jess looked up slowly. "Just eating." "You always this serious?" "Just focused." Rick leaned closer. "You know, folks here don't like people who think they're special. You might want to loosen up a bit." She smiled faintly, but her tone stayed even. "I'm not special, Mr. You said," continued ChatGPT said. "Absolutely. Here's the continuation of part 2, The Unwelcome Soldier, picking up seamlessly where we left off. This completes the full 1,200-word cinematic version, rich in realism, character tension, and emotion." Rick smirked, chewing on his toothpick. "Yeah, well, around here we do things our way. You start correcting people, folks will think you're trying to run the place." Jess looked back down at her meal. "If I see something unsafe, I'll speak up. That's all." Rick chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "See, that's exactly what I'm talking about. We don't need a hero in this factory." She didn't answer. She'd heard that word before, hero. It never sat right. Heroes didn't have nightmares. Heroes didn't bury friends under foreign skies. Heroes didn't wake up sweating at 3 a.m., wondering why they were the ones who survived. Rick walked away, muttering, and for the rest of the shift, the tension on the floor grew thicker than the steam that hung in the air. Over the next few days, Jess noticed small things, a wrench going missing, her name scratched off the tool log, someone spilling coffee over her timesheet. Petty things. But in her world, patterns mattered. Every small act told a story, and this one was clear. She was being marked as an outsider. Still, she didn't react. She kept her head down, working longer, harder, cleaner. The others noticed that too. "She's making us look bad," Carl grumbled one afternoon. Rick nodded, jaw tight. "Don't worry. I'll handle her." That Friday, the factory floor was chaos. A hydraulic line had started leaking near the main press, spraying oil across the floor. Workers were shouting, grabbing rags, trying to contain it. Jess was the first to notice that the pressure gauge was climbing too fast. "Cut the main feed," she shouted. Rick, standing near the console, waved her off. "I've got it under control." "You don't," she barked, stepping forward. "Pressure's building." He turned, glaring. "You don't tell me how to run my floor." The gauge needle slammed into the red zone. With one fluid motion, Jess lunged toward the control panel, slammed the emergency release, and twisted the manual valve shut. The pressure dropped instantly, the system groaning as it vented. For a moment, the entire factory went silent. Rick's face flushed red, half from embarrassment, half from rage. "You don't ever touch my controls again, you hear me?" Jess stared at him calmly. "You were seconds away from a blowout." "I said I had it handled." "No," she said evenly. "You didn't." Every word was measured, cold, and precise. It made him furious. That night, when most workers clocked out, Rick stayed behind with a few of his loyal crew. They gathered near the lockers, drinking cheap beer from thermoses and muttering about the soldier. "She thinks she's better than us," Carl said. Rick cracked his knuckles. "She wants to act like she runs this place? Fine. Let's remind her where she is." They laughed quietly, the sound echoing against the metal walls. The next morning, Jess arrived to find her locker pried open. Her lunch was gone, her tools scattered, and someone had drawn a crude target symbol across the inside of the door. She stood there for a moment, expression blank. Then she took a slow breath, picked up her tools, wiped the marker off, and went to work. Her silence spoke louder than anger. But by mid-shift, whispers filled the air. The story had spread. Some laughed, others felt uneasy. Even those who didn't like her began to think it had gone too far. Rick, watching her from the catwalk, felt a strange unease creep into his chest. She wasn't breaking. She wasn't even flinching. Later that week, a small safety briefing was held after an inspection order from management. Rick, irritated, stood in front of the workers and began rushing through the checklist. When Jess noticed he'd skipped a section on emergency lockouts, she raised her hand. "You missed one," she said. He glared at her. "What?" "Point 12. You skipped lockout verification. It's required." He crossed his arms. "You memorized the manual now?" "I read it," she said simply. A few workers chuckled. Rick forced a laugh. "Maybe you should be the foreman then, huh?" "No," Jess said quietly. "I just don't want anyone getting hurt." Something about her voice steady, low, and absolute made the laughter stop. After the meeting, Rick cornered her near the back corridor, away from others. "Listen, lady," he said, voice low and venomous. "You keep pulling this crap, and you're gonna find yourself out of a job." She looked him straight in the eye. "If doing my job right gets me fired, that's your problem, not mine." He took a step closer. "You think you scare me?" "No," she said, her tone flat. "But you should be more careful around that press machine. The valve seals are cracked. Someone could get hurt." Rick froze. "How do you know that?" "Because I pay attention." She walked away, leaving him standing there, rattled. That night, as she walked home, rain poured down hard, soaking her jacket. She didn't hurry. The chill didn't bother her. What bothered her was the familiar feeling creeping into her chest, the quiet before conflict, the weight of coming battle. She'd felt it before. In missions. In ambushes. When the air went still and every sound mattered. She'd hoped civilian life would be different, but people were the same everywhere. Some led, some followed, some destroyed. And bullies were universal. Back in her apartment, Jess sat on her bed and stared at her reflection in the window. She didn't recognize the woman looking back. No uniform, no insignia, just a plain worker trying to rebuild. But the fire in her eyes hadn't died. She thought of her SEAL team, of Ramirez's laughter, Sean's calm, and Torres's final words. "You're the toughest one, Jess. Promise me you won't disappear when it's over." She had promised. But promises were hard to keep when the world no longer made sense. The following Monday, tension broke. Rick deliberately reassigned her to the heaviest section loading steel plates into hydraulic presses, a job that required 2 men per station. "Think you can handle it, soldier?" he said mockingly. Jess said nothing, just nodded and began. Hours passed, sweat pouring, muscles burning. She didn't slow down once. By the end of the shift, her section was the only one ahead of schedule. Rick watched, furious and fascinated. That night, in the break room, Carl shook his head. "She's not normal, Rick. You seen how she moves? Like she's trained." Rick's eyes narrowed. "Trained for what?" Carl shrugged. "I dunno. But whatever it is, you don't want to be on her bad side." Rick forced a laugh, but deep down, something cold twisted in his gut. When the whistle blew and the factory emptied into the night, Jess lingered behind, wiping down her tools. The lights above flickered, humming softly. The day had been long, but she felt steady, unshaken. Yet she could sense the storm brewing around her, jealousy, pride, and fear, all coiling tighter each day. She'd lived long enough to recognize the signs. People like Rick didn't stop at words. They escalated. And when they did, she would be ready. Because though Jessica Hawley had traded her rifle for a wrench, one truth remained unchanged. She was still a soldier. By the time the sun rose over Millhaven that Monday, tension at Dawson Steelworks felt heavy enough to cut with a torch. You could hear it in the grinding of metal, see it in the sideways glances between workers, feel it in the silence when Jessica Hawley walked into the break room. Weeks of quiet bullying had worn thin. The small jabs, the missing tools, the whispered jokes, all of it built like pressure in a sealed chamber. The only question left was when it would blow. Jess felt it too. Her instincts were screaming louder every day. The part of her brain that had once calculated ambush zones and escape routes now mapped the factory exits, hazards, blind spots. She knew where every camera was, where the supervisor stood, who lingered too close when her back was turned. She didn't want to fight, but she could feel one coming. That morning, Rick Tully was in a mood. He'd gotten chewed out by management over the last inspection, the same one Jess had spoken up at. The higher-ups were implementing stricter safety rules now, all traced back to her observations. And in a place like Dawson Steelworks, change wasn't welcome. When Rick saw her walking across the floor, helmet under one arm, the anger that had been simmering inside him finally boiled over. "Hey, soldier," he called out, loud enough for half the crew to hear. "Management says I gotta follow your checklist now. You writing the rules around here?" Jess stopped beside a stack of steel beams. "I just pointed out was unsafe," she said evenly. "Unsafe?" he barked, stepping closer. "You think I don't know this job? I've been here 20 years. I'm not questioning your time, Rick, just your choices." The words were calm, but they hit like steel bolts. The men nearby chuckled under their breath. Low, nervous laughter. Rick's jaw tightened. "You trying to embarrass me?" He growled. "No," she said, eyes steady. "You're doing that yourself." For a second, the air froze. Then Rick's hand shot out, shoving her shoulder hard. The impact was sharp. She stumbled backward, boots scraping against the oil-streaked floor. A hollow clang echoed as her helmet hit the ground. Laughter broke out, quick, uneasy, cruel. "This ain't boot camp, sweetheart," someone shouted. Jess stayed where she was, one hand braced on the floor. The voices blurred. The laughter faded into background noise. Time slowed. Her breathing steadied. Her pulse dropped, not from fear, but from control. "Assess. Don't react." The voice of her old SEAL instructor whispered through her mind. "Count exits. Observe threats. Respond only when necessary." She rose slowly, eyes level. Rick was still sneering, expecting a scream, maybe a swing. But Jess only picked up her helmet, dusted it off, and set it under her arm. Then she turned and walked away. The laughter died instantly. No one said a word as she passed. The way she moved, calm, cold, collected, unsettled everyone watching. It wasn't the reaction they expected. It was the kind of silence that belonged to someone dangerous. She spent the rest of her shift in silence, eyes forward, hands steady. Rick kept throwing glances her way, half proud, half paranoid. The other men whispered. Some smirked, others avoided her altogether. But when the shift whistle blew that evening, Jess didn't go home. She went to the far end of the loading bay, where the noise faded and the shadows thickened. She stood alone, fists clenched. Her reflection shimmered in a puddle of rainwater on the floor, calm on the outside, storm on the inside. For years, she'd learned to bury the soldier within her, the one who fought, commanded, survived. But today, for the first time since leaving the Navy, she felt it stirring again, the old reflexes, the raw clarity, the hunger for precision and control. The factory was just metal and noise. But to her, it had become a battlefield of a different kind, one that didn't use bullets, but pride, ego, and cruelty. Word of the incident spread like wildfire. By morning, everyone in the plant had heard about the push. Some said she cried. Others claimed she nearly fought back. The truth didn't matter. Stories grew faster than facts. When Jess walked through the gates that next day, conversations stopped mid-sentence. People watched her. Some looked guilty. Others looked entertained. Rick smirked every time their eyes met. It didn't matter. She'd been through worse. At lunch, she sat in her usual spot alone, eating quietly. A younger worker named Eli, barely in his 20s, approached hesitantly. "Hey," he said, scratching the back of his neck. "Just wanted to say, what they did yesterday was messed up." Jess looked up, surprised. "You don't need to get involved." "Yeah, maybe not," he said, shrugging. "But it's not right. You saved my hand last week when that press jammed. Tully didn't even notice." She nodded once. "Just part of the job." He smiled faintly. "Maybe, but not everyone does it that way." Then he left, and for the first time in weeks, Jess felt something unfamiliar, gratitude. Maybe she wasn't as invisible as she thought. Rick, however, wasn't finished. That afternoon, he deliberately assigned Jess to a faulty welding rig, one known to flicker and stall. She spotted the issue instantly and reported it to maintenance. Rick overheard and exploded. "You trying to run this place again?" He barked. "You think I don't know my own machines?" "I'm following protocol," Jess said, calm but firm. "I don't care what you're following," he shouted, stepping forward again. "You think you can embarrass me twice?" Her hands curled at her sides. "Walk away, Rick." He laughed, stepping even closer. "Or what, soldier? You gonna call in an airstrike?" The line hit harder than he expected. Jess's face didn't change, but her eyes did, They went cold, the color of gunmetal. He hesitated for the briefest moment, sensing something primal in her stillness. Then she turned her back and walked away again. Later that night, Jess stood in her apartment, washing the grease from her hands. The water ran dark, circling the drain like smoke. She caught her reflection in the mirror, bruised on her shoulder where he'd shoved her, a faint red mark visible under the skin. She'd taken worse hits before, far worse, but this one stung differently. It wasn't physical. It was the insult, the humiliation, the quiet laughter of people who'd never faced real danger, mocking someone who'd lived through hell. For years, she'd told herself that part of her life was over, that she could be normal, that she could leave the uniform behind. But standing there, she knew, some parts of you never stop fighting. The next morning, she arrived before sunrise again. The air was cold and sharp. Mist hung low over the factory yard. As she crossed the lot, she saw Eli waiting by the entrance. He gave her a small nod. "You okay?" Jess nodded. "I've been through worse." "I bet you have," he said softly. "Just be careful. Guys like Rick don't quit easy." "I know." She adjusted her gloves. "Neither do I." Then she walked inside. The machines roared to life, the factory waking from its slumber. Around her, the same men who'd laughed now avoided her eyes. The silence had changed, no longer ridicule, but respect laced with fear. Something in her composure told them what words never could. She wasn't the kind of person you push twice. Rick watched her from the mezzanine, chewing on his lip. He couldn't understand it, why she didn't fight back, why she didn't complain, why she just kept showing up. But deep down, a thought gnawed at him. There was something about the way she moved, the way she spoke, the way her eyes scanned every room like a threat assessment. He couldn't shake the feeling that he'd pushed the wrong person. And for the first time, Rick Tully, the man who ruled the factory floor with mockery and bravado, felt something he hadn't felt in years: fear. By Thursday morning, the factory air felt electric, the kind of charge that builds before a storm. Nobody said it out loud, but everyone knew something was coming. Rick Tully's temper hadn't cooled since the incident, and Jessica Hale's silence, that steady, unshaken quiet, had become unbearable for him. Every time she passed him, she carried herself with the calm of a soldier on patrol. Steady pace, eyes ahead, back straight. No fear, no weakness, no apology. That calmness was like a mirror, one that showed Rick what he was: a bully hiding behind noise and numbers. So he decided to make an example out of her. That afternoon, the air compressor on line 4 went down again. It was one of the few tasks that required 2 workers, and Rick assigned himself as Jess's partner. Everyone watching knew what that meant. Jess didn't protest. She just nodded, grabbed her tools, and followed him down the narrow maintenance corridor, where the hiss of steam drowned most sound. Rick leaned against a pipe, smirking. "You know, Holly, you're starting to make this place tense. People don't like working around you." Jess knelt beside the compressor, adjusting the valve. "I didn't come here to be liked, Rick. I came to work." "That right?" He took a step closer. "You sure this isn't some kind of power trip? You trying to play soldier again?" Her hands stilled. Slowly, she stood up, facing him squarely. "You don't want to test that theory." Rick chuckled, but it was shaky this time. "Oh, come on. What are you gonna do? Salute me?" Jess said nothing. She just stared, long enough that the air seemed to thicken. Then she turned back to her work. That only enraged him more. As she bent down, Rick kicked the toolbox beside her, scattering her wrenches across the concrete floor. The metallic clang echoed down the corridor. "Oops," he said mockingly. "Clumsy me." Jess's hands froze mid-motion. She straightened slowly, jaw tight, eyes locked on his. "You done?" Rick smirked and took a step closer. "Not yet." Before he could say another word, she grabbed his wrist. Not roughly, not violently, but with the kind of precision that left no doubt she knew exactly what she was doing. In one fluid motion, she twisted, turned, and redirected his arm behind his back. The wrench dropped from his hand. His breath hitched. The entire movement took 2 seconds. No wasted effort, no anger, just training. She released him instantly. "Don't touch my tools," she said quietly, her tone deadly calm. Rick stumbled backward, clutching his wrist, eyes wide with shock. For a moment, he looked like a man who just realized he'd picked a fight with a lightning strike. By the time they returned to the main floor, word had already spread. Nobody knew exactly what happened, only that Rick looked rattled, and Jess's expression hadn't changed. Eli caught her on the way to the locker area. "You okay?" She gave him a faint nod. "Fine. Why?" He smirked. "Because Tully looks like he saw a ghost." Jess didn't smile, but her eyes softened slightly. Maybe he finally saw himself. Eli shook his head. "You've got more patience than anyone I've ever met." Jess zipped up her jacket. Patience runs out eventually. That night, Rick sat alone in his truck in the parking lot, long after the shift ended, staring through the windshield. His pride had been bruised, publicly. He couldn't stop replaying the moment, how fast she'd moved, how easily she'd disarmed him. He kept telling himself she just got lucky, but deep down, he knew better. There was something in her eyes, that cold precision, that terrifying composure, that didn't belong in an ordinary person. He made a few calls that night, asking around quietly. And by morning, he had his answer. Jessica Hawley wasn't just military. She was special operations. The next day, Rick came in early, but not to apologize. If anything, the knowledge made him more dangerous. His wounded ego mixed with fear, and that's a volatile combination. When Jess walked in, she could feel the stares, heavier than usual. Someone had talked. She could tell immediately from the way people whispered, from the way conversations stopped when she entered a room. Eli confirmed it an hour later. "They know," he said quietly while loading scrap steel. "About your past." Jess exhaled through her nose. "Let me guess, Tully?" He nodded. "He's been bragging about how he found out who you really are. He's saying you're some kind of killer." Jess froze. Her jaw flexed. "That's enough." Eli hesitated. "What are you going to do?" "Nothing," she said. "Not yet." By lunchtime, the factory was buzzing. Rick, emboldened by attention, decided to go further. He waited until the break room filled, and Jess walked in for her coffee. "Well, look who it is," he said loudly. "Our very own Navy hero. Maybe you can show us how to choke someone out again, huh?" Laughter followed, thin and nervous. Jess didn't look at him. She poured her coffee in silence. Rick grinned wider. "You kill anybody, huh? You ever wonder how it feels to work next to someone who's—" He didn't finish the sentence. Because Jess turned, slowly, deliberately, and met his gaze with the kind of controlled fury that could stop a man mid-word. The entire room went silent. "You think this is funny?" she said quietly. "You think serving your country makes someone dangerous? You think standing up to bullies makes someone violent?" No one moved. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound. Rick tried to laugh it off. "Hey, come on, I'm just joking." She stepped closer, voice steady but low. "You think men like you ever met danger? You think mocking people who've bled for your freedom makes you brave?" Her eyes didn't waver. "You wouldn't last a minute where I've been." Rick froze. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words never came. Jess set down her cup and turned to leave. As she passed him, she said quietly, "You started this. I'm ending it." That night, she filed an incident report, the first and only one she ever submitted. HR called her in the next morning. She told them everything: the harassment, the shove, the mocking. Calmly, factually, without emotion. When the HR rep asked why she hadn't spoken up sooner, Jess simply said, "Because I thought I could handle it. I was wrong." By the time she left the office, the storm had broken. Management called Rick in an hour later. When he came out, his face was pale, his hands shaking. He'd been suspended pending investigation. The factory floor buzzed with quiet awe. No yelling, no violence, no revenge. Just truth, sharp, clean, undeniable. Eli caught up with her by the lockers that evening. "They're saying he's finished," he said. "You really ended it." Jess smiled faintly for the first time. "No, I just stopped letting it continue." He looked at her with quiet respect. "You ever miss it? The Navy, I mean." Her eyes softened, distant. "Every day. But not the war, the purpose. Guess you found some of that here, huh?" She shook her head. "No, I just remembered who I was." When she left that night, the sky over Millhaven was painted in streaks of orange and violet. The factory lights glowed behind her like a fading memory. She'd come there hoping for peace. Instead, she found a fight of a different kind, one without medals, one fought in silence. And this time, she didn't win with weapons or orders. She won by standing up, by choosing dignity over rage, control over chaos. That was her true discipline. That was what being a SEAL had really taught her. For a few days, Dawson Steelworks went eerily quiet. The clanging rhythm of machines continued, but the laughter, the gossip, even the casual talk had vanished. Everyone had seen Rick Tully walk out with his toolbox, head down, escorted by HR. Nobody had seen him since. People didn't know what would happen next, but one thing had changed forever. Nobody dared joke about Jessica Hawley anymore. The following Monday morning, she walked through the factory gate the same way she always did, early, calm, unnoticed. She never cared for attention. But this time, eyes followed her with something new: respect. Eli nodded from across the line. A few older workers gave her quiet smiles. Even the foreman filling in for Rick looked uneasy around her, like he was afraid to say the wrong thing. Jess just did her work. No speeches, no gloating. But silence has power. Her composure spoke louder than anything she could have said. It might have stayed that way. Quiet victory, quiet dignity, if not for what happened that weekend. Late Friday night, a local paper called the Millhaven Chronicle ran a short article under its Local Heroes section. Former Navy SEAL Jessica Hall brings discipline to Dawson Steelworks. Sources confirm that Hall, who served multiple tours in Afghanistan, is one of the few women to complete the Navy's elite SEAL training program. Coworkers say her bravery and leadership changed the atmosphere at Dawson Steelworks after standing up to workplace harassment earlier this month. Jess didn't even know about it until Eli handed her the paper Monday morning. "Guess the secret's out," he said with a grin. She stared at the article for a long time. Her name, her past, her picture from years ago in uniform. She didn't remember smiling in that photo. By noon, the entire factory knew. People who had once ignored her now wanted to talk. Some came to shake her hand. Others apologized for laughing or staying silent. "You should have told us," one worker said. Jess shook her head. "I wasn't here to impress anyone." Still, the story spread, beyond the factory, beyond Millhaven. By Tuesday, local TV stations were calling. Old service friends reached out. Even her former commanding officer, Captain Ray Donovan, left a message congratulating her for keeping the standard alive. But Jess wasn't celebrating. She never wanted fame. She wanted peace. And peace was harder to find now than ever. That night, she drove to the edge of town, to the small lake where she used to sit after long shifts. The air was cool, rippling over the dark water. Her reflection looked older, stronger, tired. When she'd left the Navy, she promised herself she'd never talk about it. The medals, the missions, the scars, those were things she buried with the uniform. But here, in a small steel town far from the ocean, the truth had found her again. She closed her eyes and remembered the desert, the heat, the dust, the silence before dawn. Her squad moving through the mountains, her brothers in arms, calling her Hawk. They'd never cared that she was the only woman in the unit. To them, she was just another SEAL, reliable, precise, fearless. She'd earned their respect the hard way. And maybe, in a different way, she'd just done it again. The next morning, the factory owner himself came down, something he hadn't done in years. A short, silver-haired man named Richard Dawson. He walked the floor with the plant manager and stopped beside Jess's station. "You're Jessica Hawley?" he asked. "Yes, sir." He nodded slowly. "I read the Chronicle." "You served?" "Yes, sir," she said simply. "I served too," Dawson said quietly. "Navy Corpsman, Vietnam." They shook hands, the kind of handshake that passes unspoken understanding between veterans. "You know," Dawson said, "I built this factory on hard work and loyalty. Somewhere along the line, I let men like Tully twist that into something else. Thank you for reminding us what integrity looks like." Jess didn't know what to say. She just nodded. He smiled faintly. "We need more people like you. How do you like to lead safety training for the new recruits?" She hesitated. "Sir, I'm not." He cut her off. "You already are." By the end of the week, Jessica's story had become a symbol, not of violence, but of discipline. News outlets called her the Quiet Seal. The phrase stuck. Even the military community began to take notice. A podcast called Silent Valor invited her to speak. She declined, but the attention forced her to confront something she'd been running from, the weight of her own legacy. One night, Eli found her sitting by herself near the loading dock, staring into the glow of the furnaces. "You don't seem happy," he said. "I didn't do any of this for recognition," she replied. "Yeah," he said softly, "but maybe other people need to see it. Maybe they need to see someone who doesn't break." She looked at him, surprised by the maturity in his words. "People saw what you went through," he continued, "and now they know who you are. That changes things. For them, for women here, for everyone who's ever been quiet when they shouldn't have." Jess didn't answer, but his words stayed with her long after he walked away. The next week, Dawson Steelworks held its annual Safety and Service Recognition Day, a dull event most years, but not this one. To everyone's surprise, the final award wasn't for production or attendance. It was for leadership under adversity. When the plant manager called her name, the entire factory floor erupted in applause. Workers stood, clapped, whistled. Even those who once mocked her now cheered. Jess walked to the stage, uncertain. The spotlight felt heavy. "Ms. Hawley," the manager said into the mic, "you didn't just make this factory safer. You made it better. You reminded us what strength really looks like, quiet, steady, and unbreakable." He handed her a small plaque. Her name was carved neatly beneath the words. For courage beyond the call of duty. For a long moment, she didn't move. Then she spoke, softly, but the room fell silent to hear her. "I didn't do anything extraordinary," she said. "I just refused to stay silent when something was wrong. You don't need a uniform for that. You just need courage." The applause that followed wasn't loud. It was honest. Later that evening, she stood outside under the orange sky. The factory lights shimmered behind her, glowing like embers. Eli joined her. "You're kind of famous now," he said. She smiled faintly. "Fame fades." "Yeah," he said, "but respect lasts." She looked out toward the town, the streets she'd walked alone, the people who now nodded to her in gratitude. For the first time in years, she felt peace stirring somewhere deep inside. Not the hollow peace of isolation, but the kind that comes when you've faced the storm and stayed standing. That night, she received one more message from an old teammate she hadn't heard from in years. "Hey, Hawk, heard what happened? Not surprised. You always did win battles without firing a shot. Proud of you." Smitty Jess smiled. A single tear slid down her cheek. The soldier in her would always exist, quiet, disciplined, fierce when needed. But for the first time since she left the Navy, she understood something she hadn't before. You don't stop being who you are when the war ends. You just learn to fight different battles. For a few blessed weeks, the factory breathed easy. The noise was still there. Grinders, welders, forklifts, but the tension had gone. People laughed again, worked cleaner, treated each other with a new, quiet respect. Jessica Hawley had become part of the rhythm, not its disturbance. And the email came. It arrived on a Tuesday morning while she was reviewing safety logs in the foreman's office. The subject line was short: Department of Veterans Affairs, follow-up inquiry. Her stomach tightened. Inside, a polite notice. The Navy planned to audit several inactive duty records from her old SEAL team. They might contact her for clarification. Routine, it said. Nothing to worry about. Routine never meant nothing in her world. That night, she couldn't sleep. The desert crept back into her dreams, the glare, the dust, the echo of distant explosions. She woke before dawn, heart pounding, staring at the ceiling of her small apartment above the diner. The war had ended years ago, but it lived inside her like a dormant storm. She thought she'd outrun it. Maybe she hadn't. At the factory the next day, Eli noticed. "You okay?" he asked as they loaded steel plates onto the conveyor. "Fine," she said, though her tone betrayed fatigue. He tilted his head. "You sure? You've been zoning out. Even the new guys are scared to ask you questions." She almost smiled. "I'll be fine." But when the noon whistle blew, she didn't join the others for lunch. Instead, she stepped outside into the cold air and dialed a number she hadn't called in years. Commander Donovan, a gravelly voice answered. "It's Hawley," she said. A pause, then warmth. "Hawley, I heard about what you did out there in Millhaven. Proud of you." "They're reopening our records," she said quietly. "You know why?" He sighed. "Paperwork. Some higher-up wants to review our classified ops before release." "Don't worry, nothing to do with you." Still, his reassurance didn't reach her gut. She thanked him and hung up. But trouble came from another direction. The Chronicle ran a follow-up story about her new safety lead position. The piece was flattering, too flattering. It called her the woman who fought 2 wars, one abroad and one at home. Within hours, her face was back online. Commenters argued. Some hailed her a hero. Others called her a liar, claiming no woman had ever completed SEAL training, that it was impossible. By evening, strangers were sending her messages, demanding proof. Some were kind. Some were not. The factory phones started ringing. The company's PR manager panicked. Jess wanted to disappear. When she walked in the next morning, whispers followed her again, different from before, heavier. Doubt had replaced awe. Did she really serve? Maybe it's exaggerated. Can you imagine if she faked it? Rick Tully's old crew had found a new rumor to feed on. Jess worked in silence, ignoring the noise, but every word stung. Not because she needed validation. She'd faced far worse, but because the truth was sacred to her. She'd buried friends in that sand. She'd carried their names in her dog tags. To hear people doubt, it felt like losing them all over again. At lunch, Eli sat beside her. "You see the comments?" he asked. "Yeah? You gonna respond?" She shook her head. "No need." He frowned. "But they're questioning everything you are." "Then they don't know who I am," she said, eyes on her coffee. "Arguing won't teach them." Still, that night she pulled out the small wooden box she kept under her bed. Inside were a few medals, a folded flag, and a photo of her old unit, 7 men and 1 woman standing in the Afghan dust, smiling through exhaustion. She traced her finger over their faces. Maybe silence wasn't enough anymore. 2 days later, a black SUV pulled into the factory lot. Out stepped 2 Navy officers in dress blues. They asked for Jessica Hawley. The rumor mill exploded before they even reached her. She met them in the conference room. One introduced himself as L.T. Call Mason, the other as CMDR Vega. They explained that the audit had uncovered inconsistencies, nothing serious, just missing reports, and they needed her confirmation of certain mission details. She answered every question with crisp clarity. Coordinates, dates, unit numbers. She didn't hesitate once. When they finished, Vega said quietly, "You still carry yourself like you're on active duty." Jessica smiled faintly. "Old habits." Mason nodded. "For what it's worth, the Navy's proud of you. Whatever noise you're hearing online, let it pass. Truth has a way of surfacing." When they left, she sat alone for a while, hands trembling. That night, she dreamt of waves. By Monday morning, the story had shifted again. The Navy publicly confirmed her record in a short statement. Lieutenant Jessica Hawley, RET, served with distinction in Naval Special Warfare from 2007 to 2016 and remains an honored veteran. The trolls vanished overnight. The same outlets that doubted her now praised her even louder. The Chronicle ran a headline, "Vindicated, the Quiet Seal speaks through her actions." But Jess didn't feel vindicated. She felt tired. That evening, the factory held a small gathering in her honor. Nothing fancy. Coffee, cake, a banner someone printed saying thank you for your service. She thanked them politely, but when Eli offered to drive her home, she refused. She walked instead, through quiet streets lit by orange lamps, past the diner, down toward the lake. The wind was sharp, tugging at her jacket. She sat on the bench where she'd sat so many nights before, listening to the ripples. Somewhere behind her, the factory hummed like a distant heartbeat. She thought about everything that had happened, the shove, the silence, the exposure, the vindication. War hadn't broken her. The factory hadn't broken her. But fame, even accidental fame, had shown her how fragile peace really was. A familiar voice broke her thoughts. Couldn't sleep either? It was Dawson, the owner, in his heavy coat. She nodded. Too loud in my head. He sat beside her. That never goes away, he said softly. I still wake up some nights hearing helicopters. You? Sometimes I hear the radio static. They sat quietly for a long moment. Then Dawson said, You know, the Navy confirmed what we already knew. But I'm guessing that didn't make it any easier. It didn't, she admitted. It just reminded me that some wars don't end when you leave the field. He looked out over the water. Then maybe your mission now isn't to forget, but to teach others how to live with it. Jess turned to him, surprised. He smiled. You've already changed this place. Maybe it's time to change something bigger. The next week, Dawson Steelworks partnered with the local Veterans Outreach Program. Jess agreed, reluctantly at first, to lead workshops for vets adjusting to civilian life. The sessions were small. 6 men, 2 women, all lost in their own memories. She didn't lecture. She listened. And in those quiet rooms, filled with stories of pain and survival, she found something she hadn't expected: purpose. Her calm, her steadiness, her silence, the same traits that once made her seem distant, were exactly what others needed. One night after class, a young Marine named Cole lingered as the others left. "How do you stop it?" he asked. "The dreams. The guilt." Jess thought for a long moment. Then she said, "You don't stop it. You face it, piece by piece, until it stops owning you." He nodded, tears in his eyes. When he left, Jess realized that maybe Dawson had been right. Maybe she hadn't left the fight. She just changed her battlefield. That night, as she locked the outreach center, rain began to fall. She stood in it for a while, letting the cold wash over her. The storm had returned, not from outside, but within. Yet this time, she wasn't afraid. She had faced it once in war, again in the factory, and now in herself. And for the first time, she wasn't fighting to survive. She was fighting to heal. Spring came late that year. The frost lingered on rooftops until April, and the mornings were still cold enough to make breath visible. But at the Millhaven Veterans Outreach Center, warmth had returned, not from the heaters, but from the people. Each week, Jessica Hawley saw more faces. Some were old soldiers like her, worn but unbroken. Others were younger, veterans barely in their 20s, still haunted by what they'd seen. Word had spread. The quiet woman from Dawson Steelworks, the one who stood up when others stood down, was helping people find their footing again. Jess never liked the attention, but she couldn't deny the good it did. She'd sit in a circle of folding chairs, hands loosely clasped, and ask questions no therapist could. What's the one sound you can't forget? What's the hardest thing to forgive yourself for? At first, there'd be silence. Then slowly, stories began to spill out. Stories of fear, loss, anger, and guilt. Jess never judged. She listened, nodded, and occasionally shared small pieces of her own past. When one of the men broke down mid-sentence, she didn't tell him to be strong. She just said, "You already are." And that simple truth began to mend something in all of them. Still, it wasn't easy. The center ran on donations, and funds were always low. Some weeks, they barely had enough to keep the lights on. Jess often dipped into her own paycheck to cover supplies, notebooks, coffee, folding tables. She told no one. Eli found out one evening when he dropped by unannounced with a box of tools. "You working overtime again?" he teased, setting down the box. Jess smiled. "You could say that." He looked around the nearly empty office. 2 desks, a stack of papers, and a coffee maker that sputtered more than it brewed. "You're keeping this place alive on your own, aren't you?" She shook her head. "Not alone, just ... until we get more help." Eli exhaled. "You know, you could ask for it. People owe you a lot around here." She gave a faint smile. "No one owes me anything. If I want people to stand tall, I can't lean on them first." He looked at her for a long time. "You're not leaning," he said softly. "You're leading." By summer, the outreach center had become a haven. It wasn't fancy, mismatched chairs, coffee stains on the carpet, but it was real. Every Friday, they hosted open circle night. No schedule, no speeches, just whoever wanted to come. Some weeks it was 20 people. Some just 4. But no one ever left untouched. Jess noticed the change in them. The way eyes lifted a little higher, voices grew a little steadier. It reminded her of her old team, the bond forged not in comfort, but in shared survival. One night, a reporter showed up, a young woman named Maya Torres from the local paper. "I've been covering veteran programs for years," Maya said after the session, voice soft with awe. "But I've never seen anything like this. You've created something rare, a place where people don't have to be perfect to be respected." Jess shrugged lightly. "We're all a little broken. We just help each other carry the pieces." Maya smiled. "That's your quote, right there." The next week, the article ran under the headline, "From Navy SEAL to Healer, Jessica Hale's New Mission." It went viral again, but this time, Jess didn't hide. She was ready. Donations poured in. Local businesses sent supplies. The city council invited her to speak at a community event honoring veterans. Jess almost refused. Public speaking wasn't her comfort zone, but Dawson convinced her. "People need to hear from someone who's lived it," he said. "Not just another official in a suit." So she stood on a small outdoor stage in front of 300 people workers, veterans, families, and spoke with the same quiet conviction that once guided her team through fire. "I used to think strength meant silence," she began. "That to endure, you had to hide the pain. But I've learned that true strength is the courage to share it, to let others see you bleed so they'll know they can heal too." The crowd was silent for a long moment. Then applause broke like thunder. That night, dozens approached her, not to praise, but to thank. Parents of soldiers, wives, old comrades. They called her Lieutenant Hale again, but this time, the title meant something different. Not authority, respect, but not everyone liked the attention. Rit Tully had been demoted months ago, yet he still worked at the factory under another supervisor. He watched the rise of Jessica's reputation with a bitterness that ate at him daily. "She's just milking her story," he muttered to Carl one afternoon. "People love a good sob tale. Doesn't make her special." Carl didn't answer. He'd been to one of Jessica's veteran nights himself, quietly, without telling anyone. He'd seen what she did there. Rick continued, his voice sharp. "You'll see. These heroes always crash eventually. People like her, they fly too close to the sun." Carl looked at him calmly. "Maybe, but she's the reason half this town isn't afraid to talk about what they went through. You ever think maybe she's not flying? Maybe she's lifting everyone else?" Rick scoffed, but deep down, the words stung. One evening, after a particularly emotional group session, Jess lingered alone in the center. The chairs were stacked, lights dimmed. She sat at the table, exhausted but peaceful. On the wall behind her, a photo collage had grown, snapshots of veterans and families who'd come through the program. Smiling faces, handshakes, group hugs. She stared at it for a long time. For years, her memories of the past were filled with shadows. Now, she was building something brighter. Her phone buzzed. A message from Commander Donovan. "Heard about the outreach work. The Navy's planning a new community initiative for veterans reintegration. They're asking if you'd consider consulting. You've got the credibility and the heart." Jess read it twice. She'd never thought about working with the Navy again. The uniform felt like another lifetime. But maybe this was her new call to service. She typed a simple reply. "Tell them I'll listen." Then she put the phone down and looked around the quiet room. Her battlefield turned sanctuary. The wind rattled softly against the windows. Outside, the American flag she'd hung by the door fluttered under the moonlight. It wasn't the flag of a country she fought for anymore. It was the flag of the people she was fighting to heal. Weeks later, the outreach center was renamed Hale House. It wasn't her idea. The community insisted. The new sign was simple. Dark blue lettering over steel gray, a nod to both her Navy years and her factory roots. On the day it went up, Eli asked her to say a few words. She hesitated, then faced the small crowd that had gathered, Veterans, workers, neighbors, even a few children waving small flags. "I used to think my story ended when I left the service," she said. "But it didn't. It just changed direction. Every one of us has battles we never talk about, in war, at work, or inside our own hearts. This place isn't about erasing them. It's about learning to live with them." She looked at the sign, then back at the people. "I was pushed down once," she said quietly. "And maybe that's what it took to realize that standing up again isn't just survival. It's the start of something worth living for." The crowd erupted into applause. Eli whispered beside her, "Told you. You're not leading a center. You're building a legacy." Jess smiled. "Maybe, but I think the legacy belongs to all of us." That night, after everyone left, she stood outside Holly House and looked up at the sky. It was clear, endless, and full of quiet promise. For the first time in years, she felt something pure, not the rush of battle, not the pressure of duty, but peace. And deep in her heart, she knew the story wasn't over. It was just beginning again, this time not in war or pain, but in purpose. The morning was crisp and clear. Sunlight glinted off the dewy park pavilion where the ceremony would be held. Flags fluttered gently in the breeze, and the small crowd that had gathered buzzed with anticipation. Jessica Hyle stood at the edge of the platform, uniformed guests filing in front of her, the mayor adjusting the microphone. Her hands were clasped loosely at her waist. She'd attended dozens of military ceremonies before, promotions, retirements, medals, but this one felt different. It wasn't about her. It never had been. The ceremony began with a short speech from Captain Ray Donovan, her old commanding officer. "Lieutenant Hala," he said, voice resonating with pride, "served our nation with honor, distinction, and courage. What many don't realize is that her service didn't end when she left the Navy. She continued to serve every day, quietly, without recognition, lifting those around her." He gestured toward the audience, filled with veterans, community members, and factory workers. "Today, we honor not just her courage in the field, but her courage in the community." A ripple of applause filled the pavilion. Jessica stepped forward. Her boots made soft, deliberate clicks against the wooden platform. She could feel every pair of eyes on her yet, instead of the anxiety she would have felt years ago. There was calm, purpose. The first award presented was the Navy Commendation Medal, pinned by Captain Donovan himself. Jessica accepted it silently, hands steady. She could feel the weight of it, but also its meaning. It wasn't just a piece of metal. It was recognition of decades of dedication, of missions long hidden, of battles fought far from home. The applause rang out again, louder this time. Yet Jessica's gaze didn't wander toward herself. She looked at the people she had helped, the veterans, the young soldiers, the factory workers, who had stood beside her through the storm of whispers, doubt, and mockery. She had survived being pushed down. She had survived skepticism, fear, and the echoes of war. But this recognition wasn't for her. It was for them. Next, the mayor of Millhaven stepped forward to honor her community service. "Jessica Hala has done more than anyone could ask," he said. "Through Holly House, she has guided veterans, inspired children, and reminded all of us that strength is measured not by force, but by the lives you touch." The mayor presented her a plaque, small, elegant, engraved with the words, "For exemplary service to community and country." Jessica nodded, accepting it without flourish. She wanted to speak, but when she opened her mouth, nothing came. Not yet. Then came the moment she had not expected. Rick Tully. He stood in the back of the crowd, stiff, his face pale, dressed in a modest suit that looked borrowed. Jessica didn't react at first. She could see the tension in his posture, the way he avoided eye contact, the way he fidgeted with his hands. Eli whispered beside her, "You gonna acknowledge him?" Jessica took a deep breath. "No, not here. Not now." Rick, however, stepped forward when Captain Donovan gestured. "Lieutenant Hawley," he said, voice low, slightly trembling. I was wrong. About everything. About underestimating you. About the way I treated you." Jessica's eyes met his. She didn't soften, didn't judge. She simply nodded. "You don't know how long it took me to realize the truth," Rick continued. I hope this doesn't undo the damage I caused." Jessica shook her head. "It's not undoing anything. But it does mean you can start doing better." That was all. No lecture, no reprimand, just the quiet authority of someone who had faced worse and walked away unbroken. The audience shifted, sensing the weight of the moment. Whispers died down, replaced by respectful silence. Finally, it was Jessica's turn to speak. She stepped to the microphone, looked over the crowd, and let herself breathe. "I've been honored before," she began softly. "Medals, ranks, titles. I've earned them in war zones, on foreign soil. But nothing compares to what I've experienced here." The crowd leaned forward. "I was pushed down," she said, voice steady, "in ways I thought I could ignore. I was tested, not by enemy fire, but by people who didn't understand strength, courage, or resilience. And through it all, I learned a truth I want everyone here to remember. Strength is not measured by power, position, or medals. Strength is measured by the courage to stand up, not just for yourself, but for others." She paused, scanning the audience. Veterans, families, workers, children. "The legacy we leave isn't in recognition or fame," she continued. "It's in the lives we touch, the people we lift when they cannot lift themselves, and the courage we inspire by simply refusing to stay silent." Then she did something unexpected. "I accept these awards," she said, gesturing to the medal and plaque. "Not for me, but for everyone who has believed, struggled, and persevered alongside me. This recognition belongs to all of you. You who've fought battles invisible to the world. You who've stayed standing when it would have been easier to fall." The applause was thunderous. Veterans rose, clapping, some wiping tears. Factory workers who once mocked her now cheered loudly, faces full of admiration. For the first time in decades, Jessica felt the peace of being truly seen, not as a warrior, not as a legend, but as a human who had chosen to keep standing. After the ceremony, she walked among the crowd, shaking hands quietly, smiling faintly. Children tugged on her sleeve. Veterans thanked her personally. Eli caught up with her near the pavilion's edge. "You did it," he said softly. "I didn't," she corrected. "We did it. All of us. Standing together is the only way to win." He grinned. "You make it sound easy." Jess shook her head. "It's never easy, but it's worth it." Later that evening, the pavilion was empty. Flags drooped softly in the twilight, and the ceremony banners flapped in the breeze. Jess stood alone, looking up at the sky streaked with crimson and gold. The war zones of the past, the factory floors, the doubts and whispers, all of it had led here. Not to fame, not to glory, but to purpose. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small navy coin, worn from years of use. She spun it in her hand, letting the cool metal remind her of who she had been, who she had survived as, and who she had become. She placed it gently on the ground beside the podium, not as a token of pride, but as a silent promise to continue standing, lifting, and leading, quietly, deliberately, without need for recognition. And as the sun disappeared below the horizon, casting the town in shades of fire and shadow, Jessica Hawley walked away from the pavilion, shoulders back, eyes forward, and heart at peace. because she knew the story wasn't about medals. It was about courage. It was about standing up. And it was about leaving a legacy that could never be erased.